and welcome to video 5, where we're going to start looking at loops and repetition. In our programs, it doesn't matter what we're doing, but we will often find that there are tasks that need to be run a number of times in a number of ways. So we want to be able to automate that procedure. We want to make that nice, quick, and easy so that we don't have to go and continue to retype all of our code. As we're going back to our notes, we have our little example here already. In fact, I've got my breakfast example here, and this is a question that we would have to ask several times. Of course, at the moment, we're all stuck inside with our families, and so we would need to ask this question for everybody that's in our household. In my particular household, I have 3 people, so I would need to ask this question 3 times. Now, from a pseudocode perspective, that's actually rather simple. For all of this information, everything here has to be repeated 3 times. So at the top of my code, I would simply add in a type of loop. But what type of loop would I use? Well, if we go to the notes that we have here in our PowerPoint, which you all have access to, we can drop down to find that there are 3 types of loops. Repetition is explained in here, and to repeat through each time is known as an iteration or an iteration of the loop. But this is where we find what the different types of loops are. There are 3 types of loops in almost every programming language you will find. If there's not, then there are ways of making these work, which I'll explain in a second. So the first one that we find is called a while loop. While some condition is true, then do this thing. This is also known as a pre-test or a guarded loop. And it's called that because the test happens at the top of the code, right? So if you come to a point where you need to do something, before you start that code, before you start whatever that looping bit is, it will ask the question, does this need to be done this time? So it's not a thing that you would use very often for a specific number of times you would repeat a loop. You'd use a counted loop for that. But this is if you hit a snag where you may need to run some code. For example, if you're playing a computer game like World of Warcraft and you come up to a character that's standing in a building you've already blown up, the reasonable assumption is that that character in the building you've just exploded would be dead. So the question about having a boss scene cinematic would be kind of useless in this environment. So you would use a while loop to test at the beginning and say, is it necessary for me to run all this code? Is it really essential for this to happen? No, the boss is gone, so we can skip it. Or yes, because this is a thing that has to happen. This is why it's called a pre-test or guarded loop, because there's never a chance if you fall into this in that first situation that you'll have an infinite loop play out for you. The second type of loop, as we've got down here, is known as a repeat until loop or a post-test loop. This will always be run once, and that's why it's called an unguarded loop. There's no guard at the top here saying, can we actually protect what we're doing? There is always an opportunity for this to run at least once. In our example with World of Warcraft, if you come up to the building, you step inside, then you may have a cutscene of the boss sitting on his throne going, I am so powerful, meow, 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 meow. I will win and defeat you, you puny little wolfen, meow, 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 meow. And then you go to his dead body. This will always run once, so there will always be this one time that this will actually happen. Now, it can loop inside until a condition is met, but if that condition is met just at the beginning of the top of the next loop, it still has to run through all of the steps of the loop again. So it has to run through everything there. And this is where we have to be careful about how we put our code together and what the steps are in what order for our procedures. The last type of loop which we're going to use now is called a for next loop, also known as a counted loop. This is one where we set it up to go a specific number of times, and we expect it to run around about that number of times. Now, with these particular types of loops, as with all loops, we can still drop out of it if we need to. If we hit that condition where we don't actually need to worry about it at that time, we can still drop out of it. But a counted loop gives us a little bit more control over how many times a particular loop will run. For example, if you were doing a guessing game for numbers and you wanted to have the user pick a number between 1 and 10 that was randomly generated, you might give them 5 tries. Those 5 tries will be 5 steps in the loop, so the loop will go through 5 times. If they haven't selected it, it will drop out. If, however, they get it on the second try, you can still drop out of the loop. You can still give them their prize and do it in that way. So we're not losing anything by changing how we work things through in our loop. So let's have a look at this in practice, and we'll go back to our pseudocode. So I need to count the number of times that we are doing it. So we know, for example, in my household at the moment, there are 3 people. But what happens if we have some friends staying over? I know you can't really do that at the moment, but hypothetically, if tomorrow we were to have some friends staying over or my cousin staying over, then we would have more people in the house. So we don't want to limit ourselves in our pseudocode to specific numbers unless it's absolutely necessary. Remember that our pseudocode, while it has to be very specific, has to also be flexible enough for us to actually expand out beyond the borders of what we are doing in this particular function. So I'm going to put in a for loop for each person living in the house. We're going to ask them, what would you like for breakfast? And we're going to run through this little piece of code. But I don't need to change this code. It's going to be the same for each person. So I can simply tab that, and then it's all going to run pretty well normally. That code is going to run the same for every person. And when I get down here to the end of my code, I simply need to say that we need to repeat. That will be the pseudocode. That's all we need to add for the pseudocode for a specific numbers, for a for loop. I'll come to while loops and repeat until loops in the next couple of videos. But for now, we just want to look at the very, very basic ones of our code, of our very basic types of loops. So let's have a look at what this looks like in code, and I'll save this. So let's open our WFP program. And let's have a look. Now, we have the advantage here of actually having code that we can draw on. If we go back to our exercises, we have the using cases program already there ready for us. Now, one thing that you will see here is it has added these 2 green lines after we have closed and opened the program. That's because Dr. Samandia, who wrote this, has asked that these lines be put in. They aren't going to affect our program at all, and they haven't changed anything. We can still run our program. It will still do everything the way we want it to, etc., etc., etc. And it still should run a second time just to be annoying, although it may not on this particular case. Anyway, with this particular program, we can actually set this up now to be our looped program. So all that we need to do is we need to add a line in here. We're going to firstly, of course, good backups. We're going to change the name of this, and we're going to call it using. We're going to call it counted loop, and we're going to save this as a separate program. Again, in our exercises as counted loop. Again, remembering not to have a space in our name. Now, because this is a Pascal programming language, and because we're counting this in numbers, we do actually need to have another variable added. We're going to leave our CRT there, but we will need a variable to actually count our loops. Easiest thing to call this would be counter. When you use your variable names, you have to get into the habit of setting up your variable names to be simple. You need to make sure that your variable names are as simple as they possibly can, but also related to what they are. Breakfast is exactly what it says. It's which selection of breakfast are you going to have. Counter is exactly what it says in the tin. It's the thing that's going to do the counting for us. Now, down in under our begin line, we can add a new line in here, and this is where we can start to put our code for our loop. So in Pascal, as we have it here in the notes, where are the notes? There we are. We have to, nope. That's a while loop. That's a power loop. We use the word for here, and we use the word to define our end. So we actually define what we are going to set this up as to begin with, what we're going to set our endpoint in, and then we use our do word. So we start our program to begin with what we want our loops to run through. Whoopsie. So in here, we put in our for loop. So we're going to write for. What's our start condition going to be? Our start condition is going to be counter is defined as the number 1. So for the first person, 2, counting from 1 to how many? Well, in my particular case, there are 3 people in my household. Do all of this. that is what we want to have it do. So the thing with this is we have to put an indent in all of this. And this gets a little bit tedious because we can't just select all and paste, which I know is quite annoying, but you can get around that if you want to by using a program like Notepad++. This is my Notepad++. I am referring to this as notes because, of course, I make sure that these work before I show them to you. So this is my Notepad++, and the advantage here is I can highlight a bit and just hit Tab. We can't do that in our Windows free Pascal, but we can do that there. And then when we come down to this spot here, we then want to end our loop. So we're going to go back to the in line with our for and type end with a semicolon. So now this should loop through 3 times to run our program to see if we can, to ask the question of what people want for breakfast each time rather than having to run the program again and again and again. Let's give this a try. And why did that throw an error? Maybe I don't need that end there. Evidently I don't. So, what would you like for breakfast? What would you like? I forgot begin. Okay, Mr. Voice makes mistakes too. So, when we have, I forgot this because I didn't look at this. This is, hey, everybody makes mistakes, guys. Sorry, I'm not perfect. So in here, in our case, remember when we were breaking this up into smaller bits of code, we put these 5 right lines in a begin and end brick. That's what I missed before. When we run our code here, you'll see that it says, what would you like for breakfast 3 times? Because that's the line immediately under the counter. So it's still, we've already checked that our loop runs 3 times. But it's only going to produce the actual program once. So we need to, under the for loop, put in our begin and down here an end line. And now, because we have bricked this code together, right? This is a little process we call encapsulation. This is something we'll talk a bit more about in our last video when I talk to you about functions. But this is encapsulation. We're encapsulating that particular part of the program in its own little shell, in its own little bit. And we'll talk about that then. But this encapsulation is very important because, as you see, otherwise only one line will run. So if we run this now, here we go. What would you like for breakfast? Well, I'm going to have cornflakes. And what would you like for breakfast? We'll have muesli. And what would you like for breakfast? Let's break it and see if we can put in a different number. Incorrect selection. And that's our program working. Of course, this will run again, so we can try it one more time. I'll have Weet-Bix. And as you can see, it's put sanitary yum a bunch of times. Let's have cornflakes and let's have muesli. It works exactly what we want. So now we have added a counter for a specific number of times for this program to loop. Now, we wouldn't be able to do this just as easily with a while or a repeat loop, but when we have a specific number of times we want to loop through, that's where this works quite well. In the next video, I will show you while loops, and then we'll come on to repeat loops in a second. Thank you very much, and see you in a few minutes. And of course, if you have any problems, you can email me or post up on the Google Classroom.